Welcome to the Psychedelic Passage podcast. My name is Nick Levitch. I'm here with my co-host, Jimmy Nguyen. Thank you so much for joining us today. This week, we are talking about the afterglow period. Specifically, what is the afterglow period? Why does it happen? And how do we as journeyers grapple with this kind of extreme high that we can often experience right after a journey? And when that kind of rug gets pulled out from under us, what do we do? How do we hold it? What does all this mean? And so for purposes of our discussion today, I really want to focus on how this is held by a journeyer. In other words, how does this impact you as a journeyer? Not necessarily the full integration period as a whole, but specifically this afterglow period. And so I think the best place to start with this is what is the afterglow period? Do you want to take a stab at that one, Jimmy?
Yeah, and I also think inherently in what you were saying, you're kind of creating this distinction between the afterglow period and integration, which they do overlap to a degree, but it's important to note that it's a different component of the psychedelic process. And when we recognize it as a different component, then we could take the best advantage of it and to be aware that, there is kind of this liminal space between post-ceremony into the real integration work. And so I use a lot of imagery and do kind of visualizations. And so I recently got back from travel, and the afterglow period is what I define as it's really related to travel. So let's assume you've prepared, you're in the preparation process, you've packed your bags, you got your itinerary, you got so on and so forth. Maybe the psychedelic experience itself is like getting onto the plane and, putting on your seatbelt and, all of those things. And at some point, that the plane, the landing gears are going to come out, the wheels are going to come down, and that you will land. And so that landing process it doesn't happen abruptly, hopefully. Hopefully you have a really good, pilot, and maybe in this sense, the plant medicine or the fungi medicine. And you start this descent process, meaning you're going to land back down into linear and sober reality. Now, when you land, you got to think, you got to taxi the plane, and then you got to get off the plane, and then you got to find your baggage, and then you got to go through all these steps and then get to where you're going. And so that afterglow period is that period where you definitively know intuitively that the peak psychedelic experience is over, but you may still have some effects of the peak experience. And that's not just in the hours after the psychedelic event. The afterglow period can actually last up to 2 weeks, where you're feeling a change in some of your own emotional states, or the way that you're processing information, or the way that you are connecting dots and having aha moments. So that's what we're going to focus on in this episode, is really from the moment that your peak experience is over, probably up to
2 to 3 weeks.
Probably 2 to 3 weeks in this afterglow period. And the reason why we call it an afterglow period is, it's so appropriately named because sometimes there's this I might define it as like a buzz, or like an energetic difference, or this kind of glowy, ethereal kind of process, this kind of in-between space from you moving from, I just went through a deep psychedelic experience, to, okay, I'm officially back and in this world and in my normal reality.
Yeah, to those who've never experienced this before, I would almost characterize it as seeing the world through a fresh pair of eyes, where you start to restore some of that same curiosity, wonder, and awe that we experience living life as a child, right? The sun is a little brighter. The wind is a bit more present against your cheeks. You're sensing almost from this place of you've never sensed before. And two of the most predominant afterglow effects that we see reported by journeyers are a sense of interconnectedness with other humans, the planet, spirit, and then just an overall enhanced mood. Like I just feel better. I'm flowing with my life. It doesn't feel forced. Things aren't bothering me that used to. Like
I feel super
moving.
present, like I'm really just here in the moment. And I also want to highlight that usually with the afterglow period, probably the majority of folks who go through experiences see this more positive benefit that Nick is talking about. There's also a world where if your psychedelic experience was challenging, difficult, overwhelming, maybe it brought up a lot of things, just remember that psychedelics are what are called non-specific amplifiers, which means that the things that need to get brought forth in your work will likely get brought forth. And I also just acknowledge that there are some folks who have somewhat of a rough landing after psychedelic experiences too. So that's a little bit of a separate conversation. And we've done some episodes on, bad trips and how to find support after, psychedelic experiences. I just want to acknowledge those folks who might be listening to this and hear all of this afterglow stuff that we're talking about. They're like, well, that's not me. Like, that's not what I'm experiencing. And just know there's nothing wrong with you. You're very valid in your experience as well. And that there are potentials of ways of working with maybe even a more challenging afterglow in your benefit, in your own process of your healing.
Yeah, and interestingly enough, we've actually reviewed research studies that have indicated that a subjective positive trip will produce more intense afterglow effects. And so there's a direct correlation between how we experience the afterglow and then subjectively whether we view our actual journey as being positive or not.
Mm-hmm. I've also seen folks who go through a really challenging time. One client in particular is like, that was the most challenging yet meaningful experience that I've ever been through. Yeah. And what they actually found was they went through the challenging experience, but then the afterglow was actually really graceful. Right. They were like, I'm just laying in front of the fireplace, just drinking tea, just like sitting and just being. And boy, what a relief that is with all the work that I went through in my experience. So just know there's gradients to this stuff. And we're going to try to encapsulate the major pieces that might be helpful in your discovery of afterglow.
Yeah. And so the reason that this was such an important topic for me is because I have had a number of clients, and I'm sure you have too, that go, man, I was really riding this high for about 2 weeks after ceremony, and all of a sudden I feel like I got dropped out of the sky and right back into all my old shit. And I'm wondering, am I slipping backwards? That's right. That's where this leads to almost every journeyer is like, oh, fuck, did I just regress? Did I just go backwards?
Yeah, or other versions of this are like, I feel great. I don't need integration. I'm healed. Like, I'm good. The work is done. This thing's been lifted off of me. And then after a couple of weeks, the afterglow effects fade and they're like, I'm feeling that heaviness again. I'm feeling that weight. Like, did this even matter? Like, what's the thing here? Or another funny iteration is folks who are in their afterglow and they go too quickly into microdosing. And then if they have like a small microdose that ends up not being a microdose because you just had a peak psychedelic experience, they're like, I had to kind of check out from work for 2 to 3 hours because I was like hallucinating again. And so just some funny like iterations of what that looks like.
Totally. And so the thing that I want to stress here is that awareness is what keeps us from slipping backwards. Mm-hmm. In other words, if you're worried about not wanting to go backwards, you're not gonna. It's like this stopgap that prevents you from regressing past a certain point because you're minded to keep moving forward. The issue is what you alluded to, where if you think you healed it and it's all gone and you just turn off your awareness, that's when you actually go backwards for real. And so what I always arm my clients with is this understanding of, as long as your awareness is oriented around trying to continue moving forward, you're going to have days where you take a step back, but you're going to take 2 forward. And so there's this give and take, but you're generally tracking in the right direction. And that's really, really important because we've touched on this. Integration is not linear. This does
Yeah.
not move up a perfect staircase up and to the right.
Yeah. What I hear you saying, well, you're saying a lot, but one thing that I'm taking away from your words there is that just the mere questioning or wondering if you're slipping backwards or if you're on the right track or if you're, doing everything that you can or being in the right, cultivated, place. Just asking those questions is also an internal like checks and balances. The whole fact that you are asking means that it's in your awareness, which means that you can track it.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Precisely. The issue is when that's not in your awareness because you're feeling so good, you're going to go have 4 beers.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? Like that's not the answer here. And so that's the other thing that I think it's important for us to address in this episode is like, well, if you are feeling really good in this afterglow period, what can you do to nourish that?
Right.
And what are the things to stay away from so that you don't knock yourself out of that afterglow on day 2?
Yeah. And this is much more than just productivity in your process. I think that it can serve as a really great litmus test. I'm reminded on when you did like your diet sensitivity things and you had to go like full clean slate and then you had to go and try things individually to see, okay, does that cause inflammation? How do I feel when I eat this? How do I feel when I do that? And so it's actually pretty similar. I don't know why I thought about that, but it's really appropriate right now where one way that I think about it, Nick, you were talking about what cultivates this feeling and then what detracts from it. I also think about this in expanded versus contracted states, where the expanded state is when you're feeling like fully participatory, fully open, fully engaged, and making those decisions from that really grounded, expanded state, versus the contracted state, which might be a little more protective, might be a little more defensive, might be a little more guarded, might come from a different place. So that's just a very brief description of expanded versus contracted. So that's also another cool litmus test when you're in your afterglow, because usually when you're in your afterglow and you're present and you're in the flow, most folks are really tuned into their intuition as well. And that intuition will kind of tell you, oh, does this dinner that I have planned with these 6 people that I know really well, how does that make me feel? Does that put me in an expanded state or a contracted state? Oh, this food that I'm eating, this exercise that I'm getting or not getting, this being in nature, the nature of my work, like, do I show up to work and I realize that I'm absolutely miserable, or do I show up to work and realize, oh, like I actually do love and appreciate, what I do? And so this is why this period is so important and then also to not jump right from peak experience into like integration, as well. So there's a lot to be gained from this afterglow.
And so what I hear you saying, if I'm understanding this correctly, is that when you take actions that result in you feeling an energetic state of expansion, you are nurturing this afterglow period, and then vice versa.
Yeah, I think it's both. I think it's how do I nurture the afterglow period and kind of keep it going for as long as I can. Yeah. And then the other side is how do I use my sensitivity and acuity to be tuned into my body and to be tuned into my mind and my spirit to learn a lot from the afterglow period. So I think both of those things.
Yeah, because one of the interesting things about the afterglow period is it almost sets up a new benchmark of how good we can feel on a daily basis. Mm-hmm. And so it's like raising the bar for our capacity to feel good on any given day. And when we get a taste for what that's like, all of a sudden we realize that's available to us. Yeah. It's like, no one knew that a 4-minute mile was possible until they experienced it. Mm-hmm. One person did it and then we knew, oh, wait, it can be done.
Oh, and then a whole bunch of people did it afterwards. Yeah,
exactly. And so this is a similar thing for me where like once that neural pathway, that neural connection has been built and you've got a feeling for like a true direct experience of what that feels like, however you're perceiving the afterglow in your own reality.
Yeah.
the important thing to me is that that is available to you. You have experienced it. And
Yeah.
for most people, nothing changed externally,
Yep.
right? Like due to a series of internal changes, they're now feeling potentially better than they ever have. And so the natural thing is like, well, how do I maintain this? And what I always tell people is stick with your practices.
Mm-hmm.
Stick with your meditation, stick with your journaling, stick with your movement, stick with your nature time. Like whatever it is that you were doing in prep and you're hopefully also doing in this integration period, stick with it, because those are the things that nurture that state of presence and your state of being, which includes your emotions.
Yeah, from a neurological standpoint, from a nervous system standpoint, to an emotional state, to your spiritual state, you're creating a template that this is possible.
Right.
And then once you understand that it's possible, then it is more attainable, more tangibly. I'm not talking about like the woo-woo stuff. Like if I just think positive, I'm just gonna all of my bad shit's gonna go away. Like it doesn't work like that either. But it's really important to signal to your body and your being like, oh, this is possible. Especially when the mechanism of action of the medicine has clearly worn off. Like when you're feeling like this, I don't know, 2 weeks, 3 weeks later. And this is what Nick was talking about having the 4 beers. Like, look, like I'm not going to shame you if you want to have some drinks or whatnot, but it adds another variable to your analysis. And so what I try to share with folks, the same way that you want to have as clear of a baseline possible going into a psychedelic experience, it's also worth doing that in the afterglow and then also integration. But, you know, if you're feeling like, oh, I'm getting more rest at night and I'm waking up with more energy, but then you're also taking your sleep aids and you're maybe having 4 or 5 drinks in the night or before you go to bed, then who knows if it's actually the alcohol, maybe it's a sleep aid, maybe it's the afterglow. Like you would benefit from keeping it simple and removing some of the variables from from this process.
Yeah, I mean, if I could sum that up, it's like be mindful of your inputs when you're in the afterglow period, because each one of those inputs can alter how you perceive that period.
Right.
And so what I typically recommend avoiding if you're in the afterglow period, assuming you want to make the most of it and continue to feel the positive effects, is to avoid booze, drugs, toxic relationships, toxic inputs, whatever's going to knock you out of that state, right? Because when we talk about states, what we're talking about is a frequency, a vibration, some way of being. And these things, these inputs can adjust that frequency. And so we want to make sure that we're maintaining this really high vibe, so to speak, without ingesting inputs that would alter that.
Yeah, and I would, for those of our listeners who are not as woo-woo as Nick and I would add a parallel to what Nick just said and say it in different words that maybe apply to our Western society, which is that you have a nervous system response for every experience and every piece of stimuli or every input that you go through in your day-to-day. And so whether that's from food or whether that's from a conversation or whether that's from, you know, self-care, whether that's from the news, you have a nervous system response, and that nervous system response then fires off different, you know, hormones and different chemicals and different things. And so, you know, for example, there's a lot of people who get addicted to the feeling that they get when they watch the news, for example. And if you're not aware of what's going on from an internal mechanism standpoint, and look, there could be a lot of narratives. You might care a lot. You might be super involved in politics. You might just be wanting to be updated on world affairs. Totally valid, all of those. But there can be that neurochemistry behind it too. And so everybody has to find their own path and their own way with this. But there are things that will promote this afterglow period, this feeling of, let's say, easefulness or feeling of being fully present and participatory in life. Or conversely, this feeling of, this thing keeps nagging at me. And I know that that's the area where I need to focus my work on next. This thing keeps showing up. And it actually may be super uncomfortable, by the way, because what happens in the afterglow period is that you have a heightened sensitivity to stimuli, people, environments, places, food, like all types of stuff. That can be really beneficial.
It's like,
and that could really suck if you don't have like some parameters around this.
it's like the same thing that makes the sunset look prettier is also what makes that annoying guy shouting in the bar more annoying.
Right.
It's like the sensitivity cuts both ways.
Mm-hmm.
What's beautiful appears more beautiful, and what's ugly appears more ugly. Like you are seeing things through this very heightened sensory state, regardless of what it is. And so what I hear you saying is like boundaries around what you choose to expose yourself to or not when you're in this very heightened state is important.
Yeah, and a piece of advice to everybody, when you're looking at a sunset, don't look at the sun directly in the eye. And when there's a belligerent patron at the bar, don't look them directly in the eye either. It will probably avoid a lot of, issues for you. But, you bring up a really good point that maybe you're having a dynamic issue with somebody in your life. Maybe there's a challenge, work issue or something like that. You don't have to solve any of and all of that right away. So if you find that it benefits you for you to just be in this afterglow period and just kind of cultivate that state of being, then maybe down the road you can have that conversation with them. Maybe down the road you choose, hey, I'm not going to have that conversation with them. You know what I mean? And so just know that with the heightened sensitivity, there's also this heightened potential to be triggered, and that triggering, only you'll know whether that's beneficial to your process or not. I'm not talking about avoiding. What I'm saying is that because the afterglow period is dynamic, because there are a lot of meanders and ups and downs and all of that, Nick is very well describing that this is not a linear, like lockstep process, then you might benefit from giving yourself a little bit of room, a little bit of leeway to kind of swim with it a little bit too, especially with challenging things and triggering, things in your life. And so, I always share with folks, like, the afterglow period, Nick's talking about ways to optimize it, but what I actually find can be a real detriment to the afterglow period and integration, again, two separate things, is when we over intellectualize that process. When we try to only think about it mentally and cognitively, you just end up leaving a lot on the table if you're just processing it through your CPU, like in your brain. And so I tell folks, like, just get out of your own way and just be for a little bit and just like enjoy it for a little bit. Because like you say, Nick, the puzzle pieces know how to put themselves back together. It's then when we're trying to take a hammer and jam two pieces together and stuff like that, that's where you can find some potential, pitfalls in this process.
Totally. And I want to also differentiate between the afterglow effects and the positive behavioral, psychological, and spiritual effects, because there is a difference. The afterglow period is far less durable, and it is this very known period after serotonergic psychedelic ingestion that lasts for about 2 weeks, and it diminishes over time, which also means that day one after the journey, you're going to have a stronger afterglow typically than 2 weeks after the journey.
Mm-hmm.
But what we have, there is good research and science around, is that while those afterglow effects are roughly 2 weeks, the behavioral, psychological, and spiritual effects are sustained for 2+ years in 50% of participants in some of these studies. And so what we're saying here is not that you're never going to feel better or that there's no more benefits or anything of the sort. It's really this kind of word of warning that the afterglow period is normal, and if we can expect it and honor it for what it is, at that 2 to 3 week mark where those effects start to wear off, we know what's happening.
Mm-hmm.
It's a normal part of the process. It's
Mm-hmm.
not a failed treatment.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And it also doesn't, or it may help to avoid setting up these false expectations. And I think that it's around, we talk about setting intentions and removing expectations on how it looks or when it looks and all of that. We talk a lot about being detached in this work to specific feelings or stories and things like that. And the same thing with Afterglow. If you're worried, oh man, this thing's going to fade in 2 weeks, and then what am I going to do? Likely you're going to miss out on all the cool shit that comes with the Afterglow period. So like, just be there with it. And then when it fades, just know that that's a normal part of the process. And then you step into integration. And those things can overlap. But I want to define as well that, to me, one of the big distinctions between Afterglow and integration, actually probably two things. One is that I define Afterglow as the most important component of it is the experiencing, the being in it, the being present, the feeling, the existence of the Afterglow. Where integration to me is much more about, okay, now I've taken this whole psychedelic experience. Now what do I do about it? What are some things that I can try? What are some things that I can experiment with? What are some things that I can test and try in my life? And so that's for me to say that I'm not saying that the mental cognitive part of us is not important. What I'm saying is that there's time for that later, because we have so many folks, and we had an episode on this before about, people who were like, well, I only have 2 weeks to integrate because I'm in my Afterglow. So like, I gotta jam it all in and integrate everything, or else I'm going to miss this window. Right. And that is not the right way to do it, first and foremost, and can create a lot of pressure and a lot of expectation for you.
Yeah.
And if you're so focused on getting the A on the test, then you may miss out on the actual, learning. And so you have time. You have time for this, because there are folks who like you said in your thing about the emotional, psychological, spiritual benefits potentially lasting 2.5 years. There's folks who have one psychedelic experience and they're integrating that thing for their entire lives. There's folks who have a psychedelic experience and they're like, I actually need to come back because there's more work to do, and they come back in a month. And then, we've done an episode on the timing, around this as well. So just give yourself a break a little bit, and don't put so much pressure on yourself, and just know that there will be time for you to unfold in your process, so long as the self-awareness is there, so long as the commitment to the work is there, so long as the honesty with yourself of what's working and what's not working is there. Those are the things that are going to keep you on track to your process.
Yeah. And just this very clear reminder that just because you're out of the Afterglow period doesn't mean there's no more benefit.
Mm-hmm.
We need to separate out that the Afterglow period is a very distinct phase of integration immediately after the peak experience, and it fades, but the benefits are more durable.
Yeah.
And so I almost think about it as like this period of heightened sensitivity is different than the period in which we start to realize a lot of the benefits. They're part of each other, but just because you're not feeling like you're on top of the world anymore doesn't mean that it's a failed experience.
Yeah.
And that's where most people tend to internalize it.
Mm-hmm.
Is, oh man, it didn't work. 2 weeks worked and then it's not working anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And, we have to learn how to show up in our lives the way that we want to. And so it does take time to step into the way of being on a daily basis that we want. I mean, the Afterglow period almost feels like it's handed to us on a silver platter. But then we have to really work at it still to make that our new life's reality, into the future.
Yeah, what this brings up for me, and I know in the future we're going to do a episode about social conditioning, but as you were talking, what came up for me is it's not your fault as a journeyer that you expect that,
Right.
because it's the way that our Western society engages and has relationships with medicines. It's about taking something and it having a mechanism of action and then it wearing off. And usually those are to alleviate symptomatic things. This work in psychedelics is different. This work in psychedelics is different because because these medicines can catalyze a healing process of which we still need to be fully participatory in. And so it's different than just relying.
It's not a done for you service.
Right, exactly. Sounds sweet, but I don't know if it would work that way. I do want to clarify one thing too, because I know in a past episode, we were talking about integration and we were saying, well, when does integration start? And our answer was like, integration starts the moment that the peak experience is over. And that is true in addition to this afterglow period being true. So we're not saying that they are mutually exclusive. What I think
about
go ahead.
It's like the square and the rectangle thing. Afterglow is a part of integration, but not all integration is an afterglow.
Right. So what I want to define is that the same way that there's a dynamic kind of weaving process, ebb and flow process in afterglow is the same in integration. So there's times where integration can look really active and action oriented. And there's times where integration is like, I'm just sitting here being and allowing life to happen a little bit for me to connect some dots like here and there. And so I just wanted to, define that distinction. And perhaps I might end our episode here with any client who's worked with me knows that I have 2 golden rules after ceremony. And they sound so cliche, like so stupidly hallmarky and cliche. But you would be surprised at how awful we are at doing these 2 things. So the first one is being really kind and sweet and gentle to yourself. And that's the thing that I'm talking about not putting pressure, not putting timeline, not beating yourself up, not having this, self-critic in there. You got to be really sweet to yourself in the afterglow, and in integration and in life in general, I'll just say, but especially in afterglow, because if you are your own ally and give yourself a little bit of a break, a little bit of understanding, a little bit of compassion, likely your afterglow will be stronger and continue for a longer period of time. The other one, listen, I know how stupid this sounds, but it's so appropriate. You got to take care of your needs. And that's the physiological needs. That's a need for alone time. That's a need for social interaction. That's a need for stimulating environments and activities. That's a need for non-stimulating environments and activities. And so you have to be a steward of yourself here and take care of your needs. And if you can't take care of your needs, then that's a time to ask. That's a time to get some support and, some help. And that is really, really important in the afterglow period as well.
You got to be your own biggest advocate out there.
Yeah.
That's really key in anyone that's embarking on any kind of psychedelic healing journey. It's like, you got to be your own advocate, because you're the one that knows you the best, and only you know what you need to feel satiated. And it requires getting really clear on what those things are.
Yeah.
Anything else that you want to add today, Jimmy?
No, I feel good. I suspect that our conversation with the afterglow, and rightfully so, will probably raise more questions than we're answering in this short format, of time. But just even defining that it's a thing, and the afterglow crash, like you're talking about, can be really jarring if you don't know that it's coming. Just that's totally normal. It is totally, totally, totally normal. And so I hope that all of our listeners and viewers got a little something out of our conversation today.
So many of our episodes just result in a setting of expectations or revising of expectations, but it's true. That's what's needed to make this type of work successful. So I hope this was helpful to you all. If you have questions that have been unanswered, please reach out to us. You can download episodes of the Psychedelic Passage podcast on all major streaming platforms, whether it's Apple Podcasts, Amazon, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcasts. If you like the show, please rate and review us. It means a lot to us, and it also helps others find our show. And we'll see you all next week. Thank you so much.
The opinions expressed on this CannabisRadio.com program are those of the guests and hosts and do not necessarily reflect those of the staff and management of CannabisRadio.com. Any rebroadcast, republication, or retransmission of this program without proper consent is prohibited.